Good morning. I appreciate so much you being here for this weekend, and I do hope this is beneficial. Let me say a word about the questions before I get into what we're talking about in this first hour. This is the sort of thing that I was, at least partially my suggestion to include this period, but it's also the kind of thing that terrifies me a little bit. And there are two kinds of questions that concern me in particular. One is that kind of question that just has absolutely nothing to do with anything. And I have to try to come up with a delicate way of responding to it and when it has nothing to do with anything. And then the other question is the one that, to answer it reasonably, it'll take me at least 30 minutes of talking. And that's really not what this session is for. So as the questions come up, I'm going to look through them, and I may set some aside. And if your question gets set aside and not addressed, it's not because it's a bad question, it's not because I can't answer it, but it probably is the sort of thing that, hey, let's get together afterwards and talk, because it's peripheral to what we're talking about in this session. I'd love to talk to you about it, but it's really not on point right now, exactly on point. I know it's important to you, and I'll be happy to talk about it. Or it's a very involved question, and we've got 15 minutes or so of Q&A, and if I take 13 of them on one question, I can't get to the others at all. So that's kind of my thinking on that, and I may even specifically, say, hey, here's this question, let's talk about it afterward, and if it's peripheral and there are 15 of you that say, hey, no, stop, I want to hear that, then I'll be happy to talk about it, even if it's not exactly on point. So we'll kind of deal with that as we go a little bit more, I guess, extemporaneously and figure it out along the way. So definitely be writing those questions down. One of the great things about having the card is you don't have to remember the question for 45 minutes while I'm talking and, be ignoring everything else I'm saying while you're trying to remember this question you want to ask at the end. So you can jot it down quickly and forget about it, and we'll come back to it later on. Let me say one word about the text that Dan read out of 1 Peter chapter 3. There are two things, I guess, that I want to say about it in particular. One is there's a word I'll be using some this weekend. You've probably heard it. Many of you probably know what it's about, but just in case you're not familiar with this word, I wanted to say this at the outset. It's the word apologetics. We hear apologetics and we think apology, which means saying you did something wrong. But there's another definition of that word that is a more technical sense. It comes from a Greek word that shows up in 1 Peter 3:15. The Greek word in English, it looks like apologia. That's where we get apologetics from. And it's the word that gets translated defense, to be ready to make a defense for your faith. And that's where the word apologetics comes from. It's the study of making a defense for something. And in biblical context, it's the defense for the Bible, defense for God, defense for Christianity, something along those lines. And so we'll be using that word from time to time, just in case you're not familiar with it. And secondly, what Dan said I completely agree with, which is at the ground level, the most important thing in apologetics is to sanctify Jesus as Lord in your heart. Always being ready to make a defense. If you don't start with setting apart Jesus as holy in your heart, everything else you do is superfluous. It doesn't matter anymore. And so that is the ground level of everything. Well, in this first hour, this first session, we're going to talk about the nature of faith. And for the most part, these sessions are going to be me telling you what I think and then opening it up for Q&A. This first one, I'm going to be a little bit more interactive as we go. We'll kind of see how that goes. But I've got some points where I want to just open up for a little bit of discussion, reasoned discussion, brief discussion. As we go, we'll kind of see how that goes. I'm going to start with that, basically. I want to show you some quotes that I've come across over the years, and I want to get your initial reaction to it, your immediate, hey, this is how I think about this, one way or the other. So, as we talk about the nature of faith, George Smith, in his book, Atheism, the Case Against God, says, reason and faith are opposites to mutually exclusive terms. There is no reconciliation or common ground. Faith is belief without or in spite of reason. And that is very much a perspective that a lot of people in the world hold today. This is why I think it's important to talk about the nature of faith. Because if you have a world that thinks faith and reason are opposite things, well, is that what Christians think? Well, some probably do. Is that what Christians should think? Is that what the Bible teaches faith is? So we'll talk about that some. Secondly, Charles Templeton, who is a former Presbyterian pastor turned atheist, wrote in his book, Farewell to God, My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith, says, Christian beliefs are outdated, demonstrably untrue, and often in their various manifestations deleterious. Thank you, Mr. Templeton. That word means harmful, dangerous. And their various manifestations deleterious to individuals and to society. He goes on to say, is it not foolish to close one's eyes to the reality that much of the Christian faith is simply impossible to accept as fact? And so Templeton kind of comes back to where Smith was, right? Faith and reason are opposites. You have to close your eyes to reality because Christianity is impossible to accept as fact. So, initial thoughts, initial reactions. What do you think when you hear these quotes? Anybody? Yeah.
They're very emotional.
Okay. They're emotionally driven. We're going to talk about emotion here in a little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
I can relate to it.
Okay. That's a really good point. It is something that is relatable. People do struggle. And I tell you, this is one of the reasons why it's important to do this kind of study, is because people have questions. Christians have questions. People have doubts. Christians have doubts. And we need to understand why we believe what we believe. And if our entire lives we have actually thought that faith and reason are opposite things, and what you have to do is take this just totally blind leap of faith, well, spoiler alert, that's not what the Bible talks about when it talks about faith. So we'll come to that. What else? Dan?
It's very impressive wording. And so when I see it and I read it, if I didn't know what I know and believe what I believe, I'd be like, that sounds really good. That I can accept that. And so the way that it's expressed, and I can see how some people would read that and just take it on its face value.
Okay.
I totally can see that.
Yep. Yeah.
Particularly with Charles Templeton in his quotes, he has some kind of starting point where he's determining what's right and wrong. And I would be interested to know what the starting point is.
Okay. Yeah, so there's, especially with someone like Templeton, I mean, former Presbyterian pastor, there's baggage with a lot of people. And to be fair, that's not just true of people who have deconverted out of Christianity. People who've deconverted out of atheism, they have baggage of some kind. People who are agnostics, they have baggage of some kind. It is impossible to go into any discussion whatsoever without some sort of presupposition. Everyone has a bias. The most dangerous person there is the person who swears up and down they have no bias, because that just means they're blind to it. Everyone has presuppositions, everyone has bias, everyone has baggage. And so there's a starting point that you have. There's a basis for why you believe what you believe. There's a technical term for that we won't get into within philosophy about the theory of knowledge, basically. How do you know what you know? And so those are the sorts of questions that come up in all of this as well. All right, let's move on. That's some pretty good initial starting points, and kind of get some cards put down on the table as we think about these things. So let's talk about what faith is. And we'll talk about what faith is from a few different perspectives. First, I want to just kind of define our terms, I guess, to talk about the sort of faith that we're talking about this weekend. Because there are different kinds of faith that the Bible talks about. Any word has, here's your term of the day, any word has what is called a semantic range. The semantic range of a word are all the different things the word can mean. So, for example, you look up any word, you look up the word building in a dictionary, and that word is going to have like 3 or 4 definitions, right? Those 3 or 4 definitions, that's the semantic range of that word. It can mean any of those different things. Well, how do you know which is the right meaning? When I was a kid, I thought number 1, that's the right meaning because it's number 1, right? That's the most frequent meaning. That's why it's the highest ranked one in the dictionary. But it can mean any of those things. The way you tell is context. Context tells you what a word means in a sentence. But the semantic range is the full range of that. So there's at least 3 different kinds of faith the Bible talks about, and that's what I want to kind of put out first of all to say this is what we are talking about, what we're not talking about. So there is what the Bible, what we're going to call saving faith. Or the way that I would put this to distinguish it, I would call this trust. It's trusting in God rather than trusting in yourself. Having faith in God to save you because you know you can't save yourself. So there is this saving faith that the Bible talks about. That's not what we're talking about this weekend. There's a couple passages if you want to look them up. We're saved by faith through grace in Ephesians chapter 2, for example. We're not going to chase all of that out right now, but that's one kind of faith. There is a growing faith we might talk about as well, which is it's still trusting in God, but it's more trusting in God on a day-to-day level. Trusting in God not for your ultimate salvation, but trusting in God that He will provide for you what you need. That, you don't have to worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow has enough problems of its own. What you do is you trust in God to take care of your needs day by day. And so there's that kind of grow, and you grow in that faith by degree. I mean, do you trust in God better now than you did 10 years ago? Probably so, if you've been in a relationship with God for 10 years. That faith grows over time. What we're talking about, however, is... come on, remote, work with me. Knowing faith. This faith that you could also call belief. Intellectual assent to an idea. Accepting things as true that you can't know by experience, but that doesn't mean that you just have closed your eyes to reality, that you're not a reasoning person anymore. This is the kind of faith that we're talking about over this weekend, is this belief in things. Accepting of things that you can't know for certain, but there's evidence for anyway. So that's what we'll be working our way through. So let's talk about faith from a different perspective. What is faith not? Well, this is where I would come back to this idea of faith being a blind leap that you hear from time to time. That faith and reason are opposite things from one another. And this is how faith is characterized. I showed you a couple of quotes to that effect. That faith is closing your eyes to reality. Faith is the opposite of reason. Faith is what happens when you decide to turn off your brain and stop thinking, and then faith can come up. But that's what faith is, according to some people, that there are these two diametrically opposed entities out there. They're on opposite ends of the spectrum. Reason is over here. Faith is over here. They certainly never intersect with one another, and they don't even come close. That's how a lot of people think about faith. And again, this is not just something that's true of secularists out there in the world. This is how a lot of Christians think about faith too. People in the religious world talk about faith as a blind leap. Well, let me suggest to you, the Bible never talks about faith that way. The Bible never says, hey, you're going to face difficult questions in your life. It's best just to ignore them and not think about them. Sweep them under the rug and they'll go away. They don't. We'll talk about that more in a later session. But the biblical picture of faith is very different. So, for example, in the New Testament, you have Jesus reasoning with the elders in the temple, and the apostles through the book of Acts doing the same thing. Peter's very first sermon in Acts chapter 2 calls on his audience to carefully consider his words. As the book of Acts continues, when the gospel reaches Berea, the city of Berea, they are commended by the example that they give of carefully examining the Scripture and weighing it against Paul's words to see if it's true, to looking very carefully and closely at things. Paul goes to Athens, Greece, the intellectual capital of the world, basically, and he reasons with the philosophical elite of his day there on Mars Hill. Paul tells the Thessalonians, test everything, hold fast to what is good. Paul doesn't say, close your eyes to reality and just believe what I say. He says, test everything and hold fast to what is good. Paul prays for the growing knowledge and understanding and wisdom for the churches in Ephesus and Philippi and Colossae. Jude tells his readers to contend for the faith. And as we've already seen, Peter tells his to always be ready to give a defense for the faith. That's not blind acceptance. That's not what the Bible is talking about at any point here. Let me share with you two other passages that I think are telling here as well. In John chapter 20, Jesus has died and has been risen from the dead, and 10 of the apostles have seen Jesus, but one has not. You're all familiar with the story of Thomas, doubting Thomas, who says, I won't believe until I see with my own eyes and touch with my own hands. Then I will believe. And of course, Jesus appears to Thomas, and Thomas is amazed by this. And as that story comes to a close, Jesus says in verse 29, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This is this picture of faith. But notice what John says next. He doesn't say, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, and so you can't see, so just believe. Just believe, that's all that it takes. Now, John says Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. John says, I have written this book down. I, an eyewitness of the life of Jesus. I have written these things down so you can read them, and so you can consider them, and so you can think about them, and so you can come to faith on the basis of them. Here is the testimony. Consider the testimony and believe based on the testimony. That is not blind faith. That is what we do in every element of our life when we're called upon to believe in something that we can't see. And that happens constantly. You ever been called to a jury? You sit through a trial? Did you see what happened with your own eyes? How can you possibly make a decision? Blind faith. No. Hear the testimony, consider the testimony, come to a conclusion on the basis of the testimony. And no one says that's ridiculous. No one says that's the opposite of reason. That's what we do constantly. Anything that we have to believe one direction or the other, when we don't see with our own eyes, it's the same process. And John is saying, here is evidence for you to consider. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus is with his disciples, and John the Baptist is in prison. And John is going through a little bit of a faith crisis of his own, and so he sends his disciples to Jesus. Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 2, when John heard in prison about the deeds of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus said, "Go tell John, stop asking questions and just believe. Come on, John, get your act together, man. Don't you know that faith is the opposite of reason? So stop thinking and just believe." Okay, that's not what it says. What Jesus says is, go tell John what you hear and what you see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Jesus' response is, look at the evidence. He doesn't say, take a blind leap. He says, look at the evidence. And for what it's worth, the evidence that he points to are the very kinds of things the prophets talk about the Messiah doing. So it's not just, miracles are happening. It's the very miracles that Isaiah talked about are happening, and that's how you can come to a conclusion about who I am. So it's evidence that gets pointed to as well. And then on top of this, I think it's worth considering the fact that the Bible constantly warns against gullibility. Not only do you see reason happening, not only do you see people pointing to evidence and saying reason through the evidence, the Bible constantly says, don't just believe anything. Now, how can you on the one hand say, don't believe anything, and then on the other hand say, just blindly believe this? So in the Old Testament, in the book of Deuteronomy, for example, how do you know if a prophet's from God or not? And it deals with that topic. We won't spend our time talking about it. You can look at it, Deuteronomy 19, for example. How do you know if a message is from God? It's not just blindly believe it, because there are false messengers from God as well. And you need to be able to tell the difference. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1, the passage I have on the screen, it talks about testing the spirits to know whether they are from God or not. And so the idea that the Bible... that religion is about taking a blind leap of some kind, it's just not anywhere in the biblical text. People that are outside of Christianity, that think that's what Christianity is about, they have a false view of Christianity, and that's one thing, but what's worse is people inside the church that think that's what faith is about. We need to get beyond that. We need to be teaching against that. We need to make it clear constantly, not that we have blind faith, but there is a reason for what we believe. Well, I just want to be a person of science and reason. I don't want to have faith. Yeah, good luck with that. Live your life without faith and see how far that takes you. I mean, atheism itself is a philosophy. It's not scientifically proven that there is no God. And atheists struggle more than anything, at least those that have thought about it, they struggle more than anything with questions of origins. How did it all begin? Or has it all always existed? And if matter is eternal, if there is a what that is eternal, why is it so difficult to believe that there is a who that is eternal instead? Evolution is a faith-based belief. You cannot scientifically prove in a lab that evolution happened on a massive scale. You can see it on a smaller scale within a species, but beyond that, you have to extrapolate from evolution within a species. You have to extrapolate from that evidence to something much larger than that. Same step that we're talking about in Christianity. You have some evidence, you're extrapolating, you're taking a step of faith. You can't disprove God's existence. How would you go about disproving God's existence? I mean, you think about that. Scientifically, let's disprove God's existence. Let's go to the lab and take care of this real quick. We'll solve this question once and for all. Well, no, that's not something you can do. You can't search around the universe, and even if you could, how do you know God's not just one step ahead of you? You're looking for him on Venus, he's over there on Jupiter. One step ahead of you all the way through the universe. Oh, there's one way you could do it if you stop and think about it. If you could see everything in the universe at the exact same time, then you would know that he wasn't there. Two problems with that. One is that he might exist outside the universe if he's transcendent. Two, if you see everything in the universe at the same time, then you're God. So you've kind of disproven God by being God, and that really doesn't work either as far as that goes. You know, people have said, if God exists, may he strike me dead. I hope we all understand that that's not even remotely a good proof or disproof or anything. That might just prove that God's not petulant, is all that might prove. So, I mean, we constantly are living lives of faith. There's that big picture of atheism as a philosophy, a worldview rather than science, the things that science can't know, the things that science can't understand. But beyond that, we have faith in people constantly. We trust, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, we constantly trust people that they are who they represent themselves to be. It's just a constant in our lives. And sometimes we're disappointed later on. And sometimes it's a little thing, and sometimes it's a big thing. We trust that we can rely on our senses to be an accurate portrayal of the world around us. We trust our memories to be what actually happened in the past. We trust that other driver coming down 50 at us, 60 miles an hour, with about 3 feet of pavement and a couple yellow lines to be a responsible driver and not, a 9-year-old that stole their mom's keys. We constantly are exhibiting trust, small ways, big ways. Little things, worldview pictures. You cannot live a life without faith. It is impossible to live a life without faith of some kind. And all faith is the same thing. It is looking at the evidence, weighing the evidence, and taking a step on the basis of the evidence. And Christian faith is no different from any other kind of faith in that regard. At least it shouldn't be. And if it is, we need to correct it. We need to know why we believe what we believe. And so what I would say is faith is not a blind leap. And if I may devolve into double negatives here for a moment, I would also say that faith is not a leap. That's helpful, isn't it? What I mean is that, yes, it is based on rational evidence, but it is not equal to knowledge. It is based on knowledge, but faith is not knowledge. It's not the same thing. It's not a blind leap, but you do have to take a step. Beyond what you know, you have to make a step on the basis of evidence to a conclusion that is beyond that evidence. But the moment we know something, we experience something in such a way that we are certain of it, we no longer have faith in that thing. You've moved from faith to knowledge. And so there are things just in life that we have to have faith about, and that's true of Christianity as well. So let me give you an example that I like to give on this, and we'll have a little bit more interaction here. I'm going to tell you a statement, and I want to ask if you believe me or not, and then I'm going to ask you why you believe me. So start thinking in terms of evidence here. The statement is, I've got a set of car keys in my pocket. So there's the statement. First of all, how many of you believe me? That's blind faith right there, by the way. It's just a statement. Now, there may be some reason to believe that in general, but that's a pretty blind statement. So if I do this, all right, now, how many of you believe me? More people do, right? Okay. Why? Sounds like keys. Okay, so you hear the sound of something. What's that? A little bit of evidence. So one is you've heard a sound, sounds like keys.
You're here.
I'm here. I got here somehow, right? And so the process of moving from one place to another very frequently requires a car. So I would have to have keys to get me from one point to the other. So there's another piece of evidence that's a little bit more inferential, but still good thing to be thinking about. Dan?
I know you, your character, you would not lie to me, so I believe there's
Okay, so based on my character, you could come to that same conclusion, Matt. I have keys in my pocket. So I presume you might have keys in your pocket. In fact, I know lots of people that have keys in their pocket, and front right pocket's a pretty common place that men keep their keys. Right? Okay. Any other? Yeah. Rick?
I was close enough to see the outline of the pocket.
Okay. So you could.
That's probably keys.
Okay. So you see something in the pocket if you're close enough to see it. So there's okay. So a lot of different kind of evidence. So we have moved beyond blind faith to reasoned faith, right? Now, how could I destroy your faith completely?
Show us what's really in your pocket.
Okay, I could pull out a handful of quarters and say it's all been a big trick, and it wasn't keys at all. What did someone else say? Show you the keys. So now you don't have faith in the keys anymore. You have knowledge of the keys. You see the distinction? There's a difference between faith and knowledge, and now I can get those blasted keys out of my pocket. So that's the difference. That's the distinction. There's a difference between blind faith, reasoned faith, and knowledge. They're very different kinds of things, and you, at least in a little bit of a way there, got to experience that. But the Bible does indicate that faith isn't knowledge. So, for example, Hebrews 11 talks about faith being the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. So the Bible acknowledges that faith is about things that you don't have knowledge about. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, famous passage. We walk by faith and not by sight. One that you might not think about in this regard is 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 13. This is the great text about love, right? 1 Corinthians 13. And at the end of that text, it says, "Now there abide these three, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love." What makes love greater than faith and hope? And people have talked about this a few different ways, but one way that I want you to think about it today is that love is the thing that endures forever. Love never fails, right? But faith will stop one day. And hope will stop one day. Because in the Christian perspective, one day we will be with God. And we will no longer hope for heaven because we experience heaven. And we will no longer have to trust in God because we will see God and we will know God. Love will continue in that perspective. But faith will end when faith is replaced by sight. And we no longer walk by faith and not by sight. We live in the very presence of God at that point. And so again, the Bible does acknowledge that this is the case. And there are some things from a biblical perspective that we will not know that we cannot know. And so again, faith is a step. Faith is a reasoned step based on evidence. Let me look at a couple of these texts very quickly that help reinforce this point. Romans chapter 11 and verses 33 and 34. Paul says, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments, how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid?" You see, there are things about God that are beyond our comprehension. How unsearchable is the wisdom of God. And Paul says something similar as well over in Ephesians chapter 3 in verse 20 when he's praying a prayer for the church in Ephesus. And he says, "Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly beyond all that we are able to ask or think, To him be praise and glory and so forth and so on. Notice just how far the greatness of God goes. It's not that God is able to do everything that we ask. It's bigger than that. God is able to do everything that we ask or think. No, it's bigger than that. God is able to do beyond all that. No, it's bigger than that. He is able, Paul says, to do exceedingly, abundantly, beyond all that we are able to ask or think. The word that Paul uses here in Greek, we have not to this point found any example of this word being used before Paul writes it in Ephesians. It looks, based on the evidence that we have, that Paul coined the word here. And it's a super superlative is what it is. He's taken a superlative word, in English a superlative word is when it has EST at the end. There's something that's great. This is the greatest. That's a superlative. It's the best that there is. He's made a super superlative. He's taken a couple of superlatives. It's the greatestest. It's the most greatestest that there is. It's a made-up word to emphasize the greatness of God, exceedingly abundantly beyond all that we are able to do. You know what that means? It means we can't fathom the power of God. There are things that we don't know. That's a reality of the Christian life. But I would say that's a reality of all life as far as that goes. Well, let me move through a couple other things very quickly here. Oh, there's my texts on the screen. So let's say that we don't know everything. We can't know everything. Well, what that does not justify then is for us to turn to relativism. Relativism is a philosophy of postmodernism that we're not going to get into the details of that today. But it's a worldview that is out there that basically says everything can be true. You can have your truth, and I can have my truth, and they can be opposite of each other, and that's okay because your truth is true for you, and my truth is true for me, and it's all true. That's the basic perspective of relativism. Now, the first thing that I'd say about that is that is just about always and only seen in matters of personal conviction. It's kind of remarkable how relativism stops working when you move out of personal conviction and into the real world. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But this is a view that it poses as humble. It poses as, well, I don't want to impose my view on someone else. I want to be really humble and not say that my view is the only truth. Because saying that I have truth, well, that's an arrogant thing to do. And one of the ways that this is often displayed is in the story of the blind men and the elephant. I don't know if you've heard this story before. I'll tell it very quickly just to kind of let you hear it if you're not familiar with it. Basically, you've got 4 blind men who are examining an elephant and trying to describe what an elephant is like. And one has a hold of its trunk and says an elephant's a lot like a hose. And one has its front leg and says the elephant's a lot like a tree. One's up on its side and says, oh, the elephant, he's a lot like a wall. And the other has his tail and says the elephant's a lot like a rope. And the story goes, the relativist would say, you see, this is what life is like. We all have a small corner of the truth, and look how they're all right. And this parable shows us that relativism is true, and it's brought into religious discussions and how pluralism is true, that there could be multiple religions that are all right at the same time. And that's how the story goes. Well, let me say, I've got several problems with this story. The problem isn't that it has no use whatsoever. It is absolutely the case that people can look at the same thing from different perspectives and see different things. Absolutely, don't disagree with that at all. But the way this story is used has several logical flaws. Let's start with the fact that this is an outgrowth of something that is anti-arrogant and trying to promote humility, and it is one of the most arrogant things that anyone has ever said at all, which is, my view is the only right view, and that view is that no view is right. So the only right view is that there is no right view. So that's its own little self-contradiction in itself. But the only person who knows the truth of the elephant in this story is the relativist. Everyone else is blind. Everyone else is trying to figure it out. The person telling the story, the one trying to make the point, the one trying to prove to you that their view is the right view, he's the only one that can see everything, the narrator. So the relativist tries to say there's no such thing as truth by showing that only one thing is true, which is relativism, while he's the only one who is right and everyone else is wrong, which brings me to the second point. The only right view is that there are no right views. I mean, just read that and you see the logical problem. I don't have to expand on that at all, I don't imagine. But beyond that, the whole point of this is to disprove objective truth, right? That everyone can have their own view and they can be equally right. That truth is relative, truth is not objective. However, it must rely on objective truth to disprove objective truth. What do I mean when I say that? Well, how about this? How is an elephant's leg like a tree trunk? Yeah, because there's the objective reality of what an elephant's leg is like, and there's the objective reality of what a tree trunk is like, and they are objectively similar to each other. You see that? Objectivity, 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 this proves relativity. No, objectivity plus objectivity plus objectivity does not equal relativity. What it equals is objectivity. You have to have the objective. I mean, what if this story said an elephant's trunk, it's like a butterfly. An elephant's side is like a waterfall. An elephant's tail, it's like a Buick. I've proven relativism. No, it doesn't. You have to have a whole lot of objectivity for this story to work at all. And without objectivity, the whole thing falls apart. And then finally, what I'd say is all of them are wrong. There's not one of them that's right, because they're describing not what an elephant's leg is like, they're describing what an elephant is like. Have you ever seen an elephant and said, man, that's the most tree-looking elephant I've ever seen in my life? I've never seen an elephant look so much like a tree before. Wow, that elephant looks just like a tree. It's amazing, isn't it? No. An elephant's leg is kind of like a tree trunk, but they're not describing the elephant's leg. They're saying this is what an elephant is. Every one of them is wrong. Every one of them is right in some small way about some small part of the elephant. But they're all wrong about what an elephant is like. And you see, part of this story is this little sleight of hand motion, where we move from what I said at the beginning, yes, people can see different things from different perspectives and come away with different conclusions. They move from that to, by seeing some small part of it, they're seeing the whole thing, and they're all right somehow when none of them are actually right at all when you stop and think about it on a little bit of a deeper level. So yeah, this story has value in some ways if you take it within its actual context and its confines and apply it correctly. But the way that relativists use this story, it really just doesn't work. And then last, I'd say there's also presumption. When you bring this into religious discussions, it presumes that we're blind. It presumes that all of humanity is just grasping blindly, hoping they can find some corner of God. What if we're not blind? What if God has revealed himself? Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? What if one of the blind men, his eyes get opened and he can see the elephant? What would he say then? No, you're wrong. It's not like a snake. No, you're wrong. It's not like an elephant. It's like an elephant. It's more glorious than anything you could imagine in your blindness. What an arrogant jerk. How dare he say such a thing, right? Well, no, he can see the truth. And how bad would it be if he didn't share that truth? And tell them they only have a small piece. And what they can see in that small piece, yeah, it's right as far as it goes, but there's so much more than that. So how is it arrogant for someone who has God's revelation given to them to go to somebody that has a small corner and say, you're right, but there's so much more? I'm running out of time. We started late, though, so I can go late, right? All right. There's something very self-defeating about relativism, too. I want to spend just a moment on this, and then I'll say one last thing, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Hopefully we've got at least a couple questions to talk about. Relativism is a self-defeating worldview. It's only found, like I said, in matters of personal conviction. It's only found in religion. It's only found in philosophy. It's found in abstract areas of life. Relativism is not found in concrete areas of life. It's not found in the hard sciences. It's not found in math. 2 plus 2 is 4. No one disagrees with that, right? 2 plus 2 is not 5 or 8 or 11 or giraffe. 2 plus 2 is 4, and that's what 2 plus 2 is. It's Saturday, or it isn't Saturday. It's not Saturday and Thursday at the same time, and you can have your truth and I have my truth. It's one or the other. The Bucks won the Super Bowl, or they didn't win the Super Bowl. You had breakfast today, or you didn't have breakfast today. You caught the bus on time, or you didn't catch the bus on time. If you decide your truth is that you can fly, your truth is going to help you a lot when you decide to jump off a building. I mean, you can't just make up your own truth in hard sciences and in math and in the hard reality of daily life. And the difference between those hard realities of life and the abstract concepts of philosophy and religion, that doesn't suddenly change the nature of truth. Truth is truth. And the nature of truth that you see where it can be measured and tested, that's still the nature of truth and the abstract realities of life as well. The nature of truth does not change. And so as you move to philosophy, expect truth to behave the same way. And relativism is self-contradictory. I mean, if your perspective is that relativism is true, then, you've just proven that there's such a thing as truth. Because it's true. If it's not true, if it's just an opinion, then your opinion doesn't matter any more than mine does. So you ask yourself the question, is relativism true? Either answer is a problem for relativism as a worldview. And that's part of why it's a self-defeating sort of perspective. And the reality, when you stop and look at it on a very deep level, relativism is a crutch to avoid difficult moral issues. You don't like the truth, and so you want to come up with an alternative truth. You don't like the idea of having to tell someone that they're wrong, so you come up with some other way of making them be able to be right too. And that's all relativism really does when you look at it as far as it goes. One of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life is a lengthy academic paper written on why there is no such thing as universal truth. You stop and you think about it. How much time did this guy waste trying to prove the truth that there is no truth? And not realize at any point that he's completely self-defeating. So yeah, faith requires a step. We don't know everything, but that doesn't open the door to us saying that we know nothing, that truth no longer exists. All right, let's talk finally then about and the question of what is faith, what is necessary to have biblical faith. If I'm telling you faith is not a blind leap, that faith is a reasoned leap, that faith is not relativism, that's not the solution to the difficulties here. What is necessary to have faith? Well, three things I think at least are involved here. One is you have to have some level of understanding. If faith is not a blind leap, it has to be based on something. There has to be a ground level understanding. There has to be evidence. There has to be something there. Hebrews 11 and verse 6, you must believe that God is. There has to be some level of understanding of who God is, what God is on that ground level to begin with. Secondly, there needs to be a reason for believing, which brings us back to this passage in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Always be ready to give an answer. Faith is not just some willy-nilly, think whatever you wish whim that comes along. You woke up one Saturday and said, hey, I think I'm going to believe in God this weekend. No, that's not how people are supposed to come to faith. It's grounded on objective evidence and testimony. And finally, then, faith also is not just a vague feeling, but it comes with the need to act, the willingness to act. It's not just intellectual acceptance. It's not just an emotional reaction. The demons believe and they tremble, James says. Well, they have intellectual knowledge of God. They have an emotional reaction to God. Is that the kind of faith that the Bible wants us to have? No, not unless the Bible's commending being a demon. So no, that's not what's going on. Faith responds in a way that is practical. Faith is based on an act of the will on some level as well. All right, well, I will stop talking at this point and see if there are any question cards. Anyone have any? Want to hold them up? Dan will come grab them.
Anybody else?
If there aren't that many, then that'll get us to lunch on time, right? Get to what's really important here. Kayvon, I'm skipping your questions.
not interesting, but everyone is being attracted to the beautiful deer that is out there eating
Oh.
the tree. So everyone's Kayvon, do you have deer and don't eat it? No, I don't think so. Interesting again, yeah.
All right. Let me. I'll read the question, and then we'll kind of see how it goes. I might kind of restate it and make sure I'm getting your question the way that I want it. So, are you suggesting that this relativism or faith? Are you suggesting that this is a binary choice, or are there other options? So, are these the only two choices that there are? That's a problem that happens a lot. What is called a false distinction or a false dichotomy, where you take an issue and say, well, there's only this choice or that choice, and you've got to pick one or the other. No, really, there's a whole bunch of options in between. That happens a whole lot. And it is always, anytime you say it's one or the other, you need to be very, very careful to make sure that that's not the case, that you're not creating this false distinction, that there aren't actually other options. That's what I'm trying to say there. And so that is a real issue, a real problem, and it's a really good question to ask here. So I'm glad someone brought that up. The question is faith or relativism? I would put it in terms of objective truth or relativism. That's where I would say that there is a true binary distinction. Either there is objective truth or there is not objective truth. And I don't think there's any other option. And again, I don't think you can logically prove that there's not objective truth, because again, the moment you've proven that there's not objective truth, you've created an objective truth that there's not objective truth, thereby disproving that there's not objective truth. So I mean, I think it's logically bankrupt to say that relativism is true. And so that, I think, is where the binary distinction is. Faith or relativism, I'm not quite sure how I would bring those together. What I would say is, if there is objective truth, the question then becomes, what is that objective truth? And that's where it's not binary. I mean, it's binary. There either is a God or there isn't a God. But what is the nature of this God is a question if he does exist. That's where more options become open to us. But the binary distinction is there is objective truth, there's not objective truth, there is God, there's not God. And then once we kind of get beyond that, then it kind of opens up possibilities. But even then, if the God of Christianity is the only God that is out there, then all the other gods aren't. If the gods of Hinduism are the gods that are out there, then the God of Christianity is not. And so again, we do kind of get to this binary point at some place if there is objectivity, which again, I believe that there is. I don't know who asked that question. Is that helpful response? That good? Okay. Secondly, is it possible to be agnostic about the keys in my pocket? Can't we just say that there is something metallic? Oh, yeah. At least until I show you, there is. So, yeah, there is the possibility of agnosticism. But agnosticism only pushes the issue away. When it's a question of keys, it doesn't matter. When it's a question of God and eternity, it matters a whole lot more. And so, at that point, you start weighing the evidence more carefully. I use the keys as an illustration, and I know the question is rooted in, pushing it beyond just the keys. The keys don't matter. Other questions of life do. And so the keys are an illustration of what it means for faith to not be knowledge, what it means to hear evidence, think through evidence, and say, is it a reasonable step of faith, or is it blind faith? Is it unreasonable faith? If I'm up here making a jingling sound in my pocket and saying, I've got a pocket full of spaghetti, well, no one's going to believe that, right? So that's not reasonable based on the evidence. You'd say, no, you're crazy. You have keys in your pocket. So that's kind of an illustration of that point. But yeah, it is absolutely possible intellectually, philosophically, to be agnostic about something. And there are some things that it matters less to be agnostic about, some things it matters more to be agnostic about. All right. Why should I believe even if faith is reasonable? Well, if faith is reasonable and you decide not to believe, then you're being unreasonable, by definition. I want to say more about that, and I don't know what else to say. You should believe in anything that's reasonable to believe in, because that's what an intellectually honest person would want to do. That's what an intelligent person should do, is to look at the evidence and weigh the evidence, and if it's reasonable to believe, to believe. And in fact, we do that constantly. We do that without thinking a lot of the time. The number of times that we weigh evidence and believe something without even recognizing that that's what we're doing, it just happens constantly in our lives. And so, again, it's the question of God, which is obviously the question that we're talking about here. That's the most important, interesting question that exists. Is there a creator? Is this universe designed, or did it just happen? And if it's reasonable to believe, I'd turn the question around. Why should you not believe if faith is reasonable? Is maybe another way of thinking about that. Is that helpful? Is that you? Okay. I thought I was going to skip your questions. How do I learn to calm my curiosity in the face of things that the fact that I can't know everything? Yeah, there's the question. We'll talk more about this on Sunday morning, because we're going to talk about the topic of doubt in particular. And what I will say here, and I'll say then, and I'll say every day, and well, not every day, but the rest of my life, what I'll say is Christians have doubts. And if you don't have doubts, it either means you've lived a ridiculously incredible life and you've just never had any reason to for some reason, or you don't think hard enough, because there are things that we doubt. There are questions that we have. We struggle with things just like anyone else does. And so how do you calm your curiosities in the face of the fact that we can't know everything? Well, part of that is to recognize that that's true outside of the realm of faith as well. We don't know everything about anything. We know a lot about some things, but there are always things that we don't know everything about. And we have to accept that in life. And the question isn't, do you know everything in faith? It's, do you know enough to have confidence in God? And I believe that you can. Obviously, that's my perspective on it. And we'll, again, talk more about some of those things as we go.
That last part is mine. I didn't know I was giving it back to you, but it makes sense in my head.
You want to clarify?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So that first one, I wrote like Thomas equals me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's just because like I relate to Thomas.
Yeah.
Just like if I can't see it, I have trouble believing it.
Can I talk about that for a second? There is this perspective that people have, and Christians have this perspective too. I've had this perspective, and that is, man, if I could just see, then I would believe. If I could just experience, man, if I could have been back there with Jesus and seen him walk on that water, then my faith would be what it should be, right? You ever felt that way? A lot of us have felt that way, right? Let me tell you a story about a group of people. We think. We feel like it would make it a lot easier. Let me tell you a story about a group of people who were slaves in Egypt. And this guy comes along and says, I'm going to take you out of here. And he takes a stick and throws it on the ground and it becomes a snake. And he holds that stick up and an ocean parts and they walk across the dry land. They say we're thirsty and he hits a rock with the stick and water comes pouring out. They say we're hungry and food falls out of the sky. They get to a point and they see pyrotechnics on top of a mountain after they've been led there by a pillar of fire. And they see the glory of God in a way that no one else ever has. You know what happened to everybody in that generation except for two people? They died in the wilderness because of their lack of faith. We think that seeing will make us believe. But the number of examples of times that it hasn't happened in the Bible should really make us think, you know what, maybe there's more to faith than just seeing things. We say seeing is believing, but very often seeing is not believing. There's a choice that we have to make in faith as well. So that's I wanted to say that. I know that's not directly to your point or your question, except that it is something that touches everybody very personally. If I could just see, then I would believe. I would say the Bible itself gives you plenty of examples of cases that that's not true. Thomas is an exception. Thomas is the one who does see and believe. And other people see and believe, but that's not a clear-cut line where definitely you will believe if you can see. So. No, no.
I believe in tiptoeing around, so I'll just ask.
Yep.
You said that faith doesn't equal knowledge, but by gaining knowledge, doesn't that kind of just make the point of faith pointless? It's like by gaining knowledge, you're losing your faith,
Yeah.
but you're gaining knowledge of it.
Yeah.
So therefore, isn't the faith part less important than the knowledge?
You accept the fact that you can't have knowledge of everything. So there are kind of, I guess you want to put it on a spectrum. There is something you can't know whatsoever, so you have blind faith. There is something you can have evidence of that you weigh the evidence and consider it, and you have reasoned faith. And there is something that you have knowledge of and you no longer have faith about. And this is a great category, the things that we have knowledge of, but life itself is filled with this middle category of things that you can't know for certain one way or the other. You have to look at the evidence, weigh the evidence, consider the evidence, and come to a reasoned conclusion about it. And the point I was trying to make with that is that Christianity, worldview questions fit in this middle category. That it's not blind faith on the one hand, it's not knowledge on the other hand. It's this other category where you have to look at evidence. You have to say, what am I going to be? What is my worldview? What is my outlook on life? What is this story that everything wraps around in my thinking? What is this? Is it atheism? Is it pantheism? Is it theism? Those are kind of the three big worldviews that everything else kind of falls into that. Either there is no God, or there is a God, or everything is God. Those are kind of the views. And so how do you decide what your worldview is? Well, you decide by looking at the evidence, thinking about the evidence, coming to a reasoned conclusion. So that was my point there, is that biblical faith is this reasoned faith. It's not blind faith. It's not knowledge. Is that helpful in clarifying what I'm trying to say there? Yeah, Rick?
Just want to add that faith isn't stagnant.
Yeah.
We talk all the time about growing our faith, and you gave the example of the Bereans, they studied the scriptures daily to see if these things are true. Why? So they could grow their faith, they could
Right.
increase their faith. And so that's where the knowledge part of it comes in.
Yeah. And you had one more?
Yeah, okay, so what you just said leads into a really good. So with relativism goes with all the other religions of the world. Just everyone has their own religion and they can all be right. But where do we, or specifically you, where do you stand in telling them that they're not right?
Yeah, so how does relativism and other religions work? Well, there is I used this word a moment ago, there is a specific religious kind of relativism called pluralism, which is the view that all religions are equally right. And again, that's either correct or it's not. It goes back to the binary question. And what I would say is that it comes down to the question ultimately of has God revealed himself? If God has not revealed himself, then that story is maybe on point, that we're all blindly grasping after God and hoping to find some corner of him and being right in our own small way. If God has revealed himself and God has said, this is who I am, in fact, then anyone who is saying something other than that is wrong about God. And it's pretty black or white there. If God says, this is who I am, and someone says, this is who God is, and it's not this, then there's a problem there. How do you go about telling someone that? Very patiently and humbly. I don't think the right answer is to stand on the street corner with a megaphone and a sign shouting, you're all going to hell, you're all going to hell, Buddhism is evil or whatever. So the method of sharing that is kind of its own big topic, I guess. But the issue is, again, has God revealed himself is what it boils down to. Does that help at all? Or is there...
Gave me another question.
Okay, go ahead.
So people that follow Hinduism say their God has revealed themselves to them. And they say God has revealed themselves to me, therefore you are wrong. Who are you to say that they're wrong because of that?
That's a really big question. That comes down to, well, part of it is, how many of these people are actually saying things like that? A lot of world religions that we think are basically the same as Christianity. That's something you hear. All world religions are basically the same. No, they're not, really. There are a lot of religions that don't believe in a personal God. They certainly don't believe in one God. Even the ones that do believe in only one God don't view God the same way. So the idea that all religions are the same is not the case. A lot of these other world religions wouldn't say that God has revealed himself. They do have their scriptures of some kind. I would say it comes down to objective evidence, because a lot of people want subjective evidence. You know, I had this experience in my heart, and there's my proof. No, let's put it down on the line a little bit more and talk about objective evidence for something. And what I would say more than anything is, let's look at, and we're not going to do this right now, but let's look at the evidence for the person of Jesus. If Jesus was who he claimed to be, that answers so many other questions. And the single greatest topic to talk about there is the resurrection. If Jesus was risen from the dead, then it verifies everything that he said. And he cannot be the only way to God. I am the way, the truth, and the life. There's no way to the Father except by me. That cannot be true, and there are 50 other different ways to get to God at the same time. So I think there are things to think about along those lines, and maybe we can talk more about that. That's kind of gets to a big question. Were you going to say something?
I think you covered well.
Okay.
I just want to comment that, in some way, all religions are exclusive.
Yes.
You know, Islam's exclusive, Hinduism's exclusive. Even the Baha'i faith that says it's a melding of all the religions, they exclude the exclusivists.
Right.
So,
Well, it's
every religion is exclusive in some way.
That's right. Religions by nature are exclusive. Worldviews by nature are exclusive. Relativism is exclusive. There's nothing that isn't exclusive, because the moment you say this is the right view, you're excluding everyone else that disagrees with that. And even with the, everything is true, this is the truth, you're excluding anyone who disagrees with relativism.
And I'm glad you made the point about, if you look at who Jesus is, that answers pretty much all the other questions, because if there's only one man who showed up and claimed to be God and proved it. You know, Muhammad said he received revelation in a cave. Confucius said, based on wisdom, not all these things. Hinduism even, the only one that ever showed up and did something about it and proved that he was who he was really Jesus Christ.
Yeah. All right, well, we are about as much past the time as we started late, so I think that's a good indication. Yeah, go ahead. Faith, can I talk to you about that afterward? If you have faith of a mustard seed, you can say, what Jesus says, you can say to this mountain, pick it up and throw it into the sea. And Jesus is talking about the Temple Mount specifically, this mountain. What he's going to immediately follow that discussion with is the discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem. And so that's part of a larger discussion about not just, you walk around saying, hey, I believe, hey, mountain, move, That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about something very specific to the question of the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans that's coming soon. So it's a little bit of a different kind of topic, I guess.